Good evening, listeners. I'm your host, Jerome, and welcome to the Afterlife Archives. For this week's podcast, we'll discuss the afterlife beliefs, mortuary practices, and archaeological findings of Nordic Vikings. As a starting point, we need to establish what a Viking is. Vikings were primarily seafaring warriors who originated from Scandinavia. People often think of Vikings as barbaric, violent, and overall brash because of pop culture. However, Vikings were ceremonial as well. As most people already know, Vikings had an affinity for water burials, where they set off the deceased on a ship into the ocean, then using flaming arrows, they set the ship ablaze. This, along with the thought process of Norse mythology of if the death had occurred in battle, and only then would the deceased pass on to Valhalla. Valhalla being a sub-realm of Asgard, one of the 9 realms of the world which all reside along Yggdrasil, more known as the World Tree. Today, though, we'll be focusing mostly on Asgard, the Norse equivalent of heaven, Midgard, the realm where humans reside, and Hel, the final resting place of the ill, the old, and the boring. Given the archaeological evidence that we have gathered so far, there's more or less a consistency with how the dead were buried during the Viking Age, this being primarily cremation and the occasional inhumation. Where the differences start to appear is in the way the deceased were buried. In many cases, different places had different things that they used as grave goods, ranging from small artifacts to vehicles such as farming equipment, and in some rare cases, the funerary practices included other people that passed in a correlated way to the funeral of the originally deceased. Wild concept. Imagine you have a funeral for a dearly beloved family member, and then somebody happens to die at that funeral, and they're buried along with a family member. That would not fly in the modern age. The effects that the deceased were buried with was not the only source of variation, but the way the burial was constructed, the body, positioning, and how elaborate the graves were as well. Island settlements had a special funerary rituals that differed from their respective mainlands. The Viking funerary ritual as a whole was a smorgasbord of several different cultures such as Slavic and Khazar. With vast differences in funerary rituals, it's very difficult to group specific sites with the Viking populations. However, this does not necessarily indicate that differences are based on treatments of the deceased individual, but more to the fact the Vikings as a whole were multiple cultures and ethnicities. In each individual culture, though there are clear signs of selective burials, most people are not entitled to a burial at all. Slaves had little to no evidence of burials, and it's written in literature of the time that slaves who had passed whilst on a journey had just been left. Children are in the same figurative boat. There is little evidence of children receiving any sort of funerary practice, which leads to the thought of whether children were considered worthy of burial at all. The few children that have been found have also been part of preferential treatment mentioned before. The child of someone important, for example, like the head leader, the chieftain. The few people who were entitled to burials were most often cremated, and most times they were simply burned on the pyre and then buried in the same place, moved to a mound, or placed in a pot or urn prior to being buried. The way the grave goods were buried with the individual varied as well, as they were either burned with the individual, broken and scattered with the ashes as a sense of death for the object, or placed prior in the ashes, gently scattered on top. It is with the items that the individual was laid to rest with where we see the variation the most. Among most common were jewelry, weapons, tools for textile making, and food preparation, among others. One notable example is from the Åland Islands, where the dead were buried in pottery, with a clay animal paw left unburned and placed on the top of the pot. The mounds themselves also had a great deal of variation. They ranged from small bumps in the terrain to huge monuments up to 10 meters tall, in all shapes from circular to oval to even triangular with supports along the sides. According to archaeological evidence, these mounds were left unmarked in the sense of identifying the deceased individual. However, there is evidence within Arabic literature from the time that the mounds had posts with runes marking the deceased. Other markings were often stones laid surrounding the mounds, such as botestenar, which are standing stones, and trudar, which are known as three-pointers. Trudar are often believed to be the roots and the branches of Yggdrasil, the World Tree. Inhumation was significantly rare when it came to burial practices of the Viking Age, most of them being more or less what we now consider regular and common. They were often buried either directly in rectangular holes that were dug out, wrapped in fabric, laid in a box, or even placed on a wooden board. These bodies were usually placed on their back or on their side, slightly curled up as if sleeping. However, there are a few instances that which individuals were buried in incongruent positions and on more than one occasion with limbs removed. These outlying positions were thought to be due to the thought that the individuals would somehow return. This concept is due to stones placed on the gravesites as if to keep the individuals in their graves. The grave goods that the individuals were buried with were often as varied, if not more. In some cases, there were animal and or human sacrifices buried with the individual, which is assumed to be due to the position of a higher status. The shoes that the bodies were adorned with is where the Norse mythological concept of hell comes in. The shoes were thought to be needed for the deceased to pass through hell and were referred as hell shoes. There are recorded cases where the methods of transportation, such as ships, wagons, and even horses, buried with the dead to signify the individual's passing while on a journey. Both types of burials were often in group setting, ranging from small plots to the family farm to large cemeteries containing dozens to thousands of plots. These cemeteries were not placed far from the settlements, but close enough to still be considered part of the town. One of the most notable examples is in Lindholm, Hoge, in northern Jutland. This cemetery was buried by sand and had been blown over by the wind, thus keeping it perfectly preserved. Each grave was marked with a stone, with no organized pattern. Aside from cemeteries and small plots, there have been some cases of mass graves that have thought to be due to some large-scale battle. The final type of burial that was present during the Viking Age was the chamber burial, where an individual of usually higher status is buried not in a container, but underground in a catacomb-like structure. These burials, for the more modest examples, were large boxes placed in the grave. The individual was buried inside said box. For the more common type of chamber burial, they were the size of rooms dug out, then with wooden walls and roofs. These types are the most extravagant burials that came from the Viking Age, with every example being different from the next, with each having parts of local culture and funerary practices. One of the most examples of the aforementioned extravagance was at Hedby, where there was a ship in its entirety placed on top of the chamber. Another example is the Mammon grave in Denmark, where a prince-like Viking man is buried in a large castle-like hall-like chamber with a reinforced pointed roof and walls. For a quick little break, I'd like to thank our sponsor, Patreon. You can find us on patreon.com/thisisnotareal website. Oftentimes, there were ritual killings going along with a regular funeral. These secondary bodies were either usually wives of the deceased, loyal followers, and/or slaves. In most cases, these secondary bodies were thought to have followed the deceased willingly into the afterlife. The reasoning was that they needed to follow the deceased into the other world, as if the Viking mentality were that the deceased property, not a separate human being. There is a well-recorded instance of a ritual killing of a slave girl by an Arab writer, Ibn Fadlan, who had happened to be in a Rus settlement for diplomatic relations while there was an ongoing funeral ceremony. Fadlan noted that the slave girl who was part of the ritual was raped several times by the deceased followers in one of the aforementioned burial chambers. They have been erected for the deceased. This girl was drugged and raped, as noted by Fadlan, as a posthumous marriage between the girl and the deceased. The followers who participated were thought to have acted as representatives. However, it was not just female slaves that were part of the rituals, though they were more often willing to participate. The main reason the women were part of the ritual were supposedly to serve as a female companion in the afterlife. To be clear, though, the only way we can understand this information is through literature. Archaeological evidence relates to the fact that sacrifices were rare, and only with a few prominent examples. Even within the examples that have been studied, the Occam's razor principle applies. They could simply have been family, close friends, or even lovers in most cases. There were two different ways that these sacrificial killings occurred, according to Fadlan. There was a slave girl scenario where the person is killed in private and near to the deceased, and then there's the other type where it was mostly a show for the locals to celebrate the vitality and the life of the deceased. We'd like to thank our second sponsor, our merch store at thisisnotonwebsite.com/afterlifearchives. To go even more in depth with the ship burials, in each case of them there is a repeating pattern. Each ship ranged from a small fishing boat to long ships around 30 meters in length. The ship were placed in dark trenches. Bodies of several individuals were placed on board regardless of gender. These bodies had individual positions, such as lying in beds, sitting in chairs, propped up on cushions, or simply placed on the ship. Each body was surrounded by personal belongings and weapons. Feasts were often laid out with the deceased, tables filled with the classic Viking drinking horns with beverages to coincide with them. Offerings of food and medicinal herbs were placed with the bodies, as well as sacrificial animal corpses and the occasional person who was killed at the funeral. Even home furnishings such as looms were brought onto the ships. All of the ship burials have been studied have been each different event with little to no similarity between one another aside from a similar core formula and an overarching concept, each being heavily dependent on the social environment surrounding them. The way these ships have been found was either lifted into a pyre and burned, with the only thing remaining being an outline of the boat and ash and the metal rivets that couldn't be burned, or the dead being buried in a mound with the ship placed on top, and finally with the ship being buried in its entirety and the mast protruding out to the top of the mound. Some of these ships have been extraordinarily well preserved due to the clay they were buried in, keeping the perfect environment for preservation. One of the most notable examples of this is the Osberg in Ostjolfjord, Norway. This ship is one of the best examples of Viking Age Scandinavia due to the amount of organic materials that have been preserved. It has been long debated on the purpose of these ships. It could be the simple concept of it being one's deceased possessions, or even a vessel decided to aid them in the afterlife. One interesting thought on this topic is that it could solely be based on Norse mythology due to imagery. The Norse god Balder having a funerary ship of his own, Skidbladnir, the collapsible ship of Freyr, and Naglfar, the ship made of fingernails of the deceased with a crew of everyone who was ever drowned, and captained by Loki himself. Another thought is these ships were metaphorical buildings of high chieftains, with them being a source of spiritual energy for the rest of the surrounding settlement, which goes against the thought of death being a journey. There have been some of these ship burials that have been left open to people for a while after the funerary ceremony had passed. Parts of the ship have even been left visible, with tents surrounding them as well. As mentioned earlier, Fadlan attended the funeral of a Rus chieftain. In his description of the chieftain was placed in a temporary grave along some temporary grave goods such as food, drink, and a musical instrument to keep the deceased entertained until the official funerary ceremony, which would occur 10 days later. Within those 10 days, there is a huge celebration of life where there's lots of sex and drinking to the verge of death. During those 10 days, the burial outfit of the chief is made, as well as the slave girl chosen to be the bride, as mentioned earlier. On the 10th day, the ship is placed onto a pyre. A tent is then set up on the deck of the ship. The deceased is removed from the temporary grave and placed in the tent, propped up on the bed with visits. Following each of the visits, brings the deceased offerings such as herbs, alcohol, and foods of various kinds. Then a lot of gore that cannot be said on a podcast, and entails a lot of animal sacrifice with very visual details. The slave girl is placed on the bed next to the deceased, and the aforementioned actions are then performed, finishing with her being killed by stabbing. Once all of the living have left the vessel, a naked man sets the vessel on fire in a circular pattern. Once the ashes have cooled sufficiently, a mound is erected on top, and a birch pole is placed atop with runes carved in what is assumed to be the name of the chieftain. To conclude today's episode, Vikings were extraordinary with massive theatrical funerary practices for the high-ranking individuals, with the form of burial often consisting in most cases cremation, humation, and the occasional chamber burial, reserved for the upper echelon of their society. The Vikings had some of the most theatrical celebrations of life, with ongoing parties full of sex and copious amounts of alcohol, yet they remained as violent as we know them from pop culture, with all the sacrifices and ritual killing. All for the deceased to pass on to the afterlife with the best chances possible according to their mythology. Once again, thank you to our sponsors, and tune in next week where we will discuss what a funerary practices could look like on Mars. This has been Afterlife Archives with your host, Jerome. Have a spooky night.